All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. All right, before we get into the book today, I'm going to check out this scene from Gundam Wing. Now, the reason why I'm showing this is to prove pretty conclusively that this specific Gundam Wing, series of the Gundam series is specifically talking about the topics that we're covering in this book. It's specifically referring to World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement, Zionists, Nazis, and basically, you know, Hero is supposed to be the United States, Duo is supposed to be Western Europe, Troa is Eastern Europe, Wu Fei is like Asia, and then what's his name? Katya? I can't remember his name. Katra. He's supposed to be North Africa. It's like, come on. This show is based off of World War II. It's pretty much undeniable, and it's all about the stuff that's in this book, the intrigue and the secret agreements and the secret alliances and people switching alliances midway through the war and all this stuff, right? And the Gundams are supposed to be tanks. That's why they're like signified in Mark 1, Mark 2, right? And then it's just interesting because, you've got the Principality of Zeon, right? And it's just so interesting that those two syllables, not if you reverse the word, but if you reverse the syllables, it's like Zeon and Nazi, right? They're almost the same. They're just reverse syllables. Zion, Nazi. Zeon, Nazi, right? It's like the same thing, right? And then they were working together. Maybe I'm going a little too far off the rails with that, but maybe I'm not. But anyway, we're going to watch this clip real quick, and it's going to basically be irrefutable proof that this cartoon series is about the specific topics that I'm talking about in the book.
Within the military of the United Earthsphere Alliance in the expansion of armaments. However, there were many that disliked and distrusted the specials. Young leaders are trying to start a new trend. Colonel Trey's Kushranada is the aristocratic founder of the specials. He is also an official of the mysterious Rockefeller Foundation, financially backed by royalty and aristocrats who place importance on tradition. With this...
Wait. Did you catch that? He's backed by the Rockefeller Foundation. Let me just go back real quick so you can make sure you get that. That he's an aristocrat, a European aristocrat that's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And they're also working for the Principality of Zeon. Like, come on. If you're not convinced that this is about World War II, I don't know what will convince you.
He is also an official of the mysterious Rockefeller Foundation, financially backed by royalty and aristocrats who place importance on tradition. With this strong backing, Trey's has focused on the development of mobile suits. Specials is a complete unit that not only supplies mobile suits to the Alliance, but have also started instructing the Combat Army Corps. Their reputation on the battleground is excellent, earning them the right to act independently anytime and at any battle they wish. However,
so they can act independently from any state and engage in any battle that they wish at any time. The Rockefeller Foundation can do this.
It can't be denied that this status has angered the elder soldiers even more.
These men confuse the battleground for some kind of aristocratic game. They want to kill so badly they're sparking things up themselves.
No, come on. We're on the chapter right now where the people want to kill so badly that they're sparking up things themselves. We're on that chapter right now in Tragedy and Hope. right? The Principality of Zion, the Rockefeller Foundation. I mean, come on. If this is not about World War II, then nothing is about World War II.
We mustn't be persuaded by them. If we proceed cautiously, we can avoid any unnecessary battle. I'll teach those bloodthirsty specials a few things about intelligent battle.
So Commander Bonaparte isn't here.
We're just going to skip over the Commander Bonaparte thing and pretend like this isn't about Europe and World War II. We'll pretend that this cartoon is not about that. All right, I'm just going to leave it there on the Rockefeller Foundation part of Gundam Wing, where they're talking about the Rockefeller Foundation and how the princess is secretly the princess of Zion, but she has to go into hiding because, you know, she's got to go into hiding because she's the princess of Zion. Not the Nazis, not Zion, but Zion. All right, we're going to get into the book now. We're on World War II, Tide of Aggression, 1939 to 1941. On page 668, the Sitzkrieg, September 1939 to May 1940. The period from the end of the Polish campaign to the German attack on Denmark and Norway on April 9th, 1940, is frequently called the Sitzkrieg, or Sitting War, or even the Phony War, because the Western powers made no real effort to fight Germany. These powers were eager to use the slow process of economic blockade as their chief weapon in order to avoid casualties. So long as he remained in office, Chamberlain was convinced that no military decision could be reached and that Germany could be beaten only by economic measures. Even after the fall of France, the British Chiefs of Staff declared, "Upon the economic factor depends our only hope of bringing about the downfall of Germany." I don't know. If Britain keeps on sending them money and supplies, that's not going to work. Early in October, Hitler made a tentative offer to negotiate peace with the Western powers on the grounds that the cause of the fighting, Poland, no longer existed. Why would you put a comma there? This offer was rejected by the Western powers with the public declaration that they were determined to destroy Hitler's regime. This meant that the war must continue. The British answer to Hitler's offer, and possibly the French answer as well, was not based so much on a desire to continue with the war as it was on the belief that Hitler's rule in Germany was insecure and that the best way to reach peace would be to encourage some anti-Hitler movement within Germany itself. Chamberlain had a passionate personal hatred of Hitler for having destroyed his plans for appeasement. He hoped that a long economic blockade would give rise to such discontent inside Germany that Hitler would be removed and peace made. German mobilization, the Allied Economical Brigade. Germany was extremely vulnerable to a blockade, but its effects were indecisive. In spite of some casual threats by Hitler that Germany was prepared for a war of any duration, no plans had been made for a long war, and there was no real effort towards economic stabilization by Germany before 1943. The country's industrial plant for making armaments was increased only slightly in the 5 years 1937 to 1942, so that, contrary to general opinion, Germany was neither armed to the teeth nor fully mobilized in this period. In each of the 4 years, 1939 to 1942, Britain's production of tanks, self-propelled guns, and planes was higher than Germany's. In the first 4 months of the war, September to December 1939, for example, England produced 314 tanks while Germany produced 247. The Germans expected each military campaign to be of such brief duration that no real economic mobilization would be necessary. This policy was successful until Hitler bogged down in Russia. These sentences. Okay. This policy was successful until Hitler was bogged down in Russia in 1941, but even there, the Fuhrer's conviction that Russia would collapse after just one more attack delayed economic mobilization for months. As late as September 1941, Hitler issued an order for a substantial reduction in armaments production, and the counter-order calling for full mobilization of German economic system was not issued until the last day of that year. Even then, the mobilization was never total or anything like it. The captured records of the German War Ministry for the year 1944, the year of the big effort, show that only about 33% of Germany's output in that year went for direct war purposes compared to 40% in the United States and almost 45% in Britain. The results of this effort in airplane production can be seen in the fact that Germany produced almost 40,000 aircraft of all kinds in that year, 1944, while England produced almost 30,000 and the United States produced over 96,000 military aircraft in the same year. Germany's economic mobilization, which began in 1942, was to have been carried out by Fritz Todt, the engineer who had been in charge of the construction of the West Wall. Todt, however, was killed in an airplane crash on February 12, 1942. His successor, Albert Speer, was an engineer of great ability, but he had to share his functions with several other offices, including Göring's 4-year plan organization, and he spent most of his time negotiating agreements to obtain needed resources from these. A central planning board, on which Speer was one of 4 men, had powers of top allocation of material resources, but no control over labor. On September 2, 1943, Speer's office was amalgamated with the Raw Materials Department of the Ministry of Economics to form a Ministry of Armaments and War Production. This new organization obtained control of more and more of the production program without ever obtaining important parts of it. It took 18 months to get control of naval construction, including submarines and guns, July 1943 to December 1944, while Speer took over production of fighter planes only in March 1944 and of all other planes except jets in June 1944. At the same time, more and more war production was getting into the hands of the SS because its control of concentration camps gave it the largest available supply of labor. As a result, Speer's office never had anything like complete control of economic mobilization. It is amazing that Germany could have carried on such a great war effort with such a ramshackle organization of its economic life. When Germany began the war in September 1939, less than a third of its oil, rubber, and iron ore were of domestic origin. It had only 2 months' supply of gasoline at the peacetime rate of consumption and about 3 months' supply of aviation fuel. Germany expended less than 100,000 tons of gasoline and oil in Poland and less than 500,000 tons in the conquest of Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in the period April through June 1940, but captured in the process about 2 million tons, mostly in France. At first, the British economic warfare against Germany was quantitative rather than qualitative, seeking to reduce the supply of all war material rather than concentrating attention, as was done later, on interrupting the supply of a few vital commodities such as ball bearings or aviation fuel. The blockade, with little real effort, was able to cut off immediately over half of Germany's supply of petroleum products and almost half of its iron ore, but, in general, the blockade was established slowly. There was very poor Anglo-French coordination for the whole period before the fall of France in June 1940, and there was a general agreement not to use aerial bombardment, preemptive buying, export controls of enemy products, or rationing of neutral purchases. These special techniques of economic warfare began to be applied only in the spring of 1940, just before they were disrupted by the fall of France. The early British efforts to control contraband and to obtain a quantitative restriction on German imports placed a burden on the Navy which it was unable to bear, particularly because of the demand for naval vessels for convoy duty. In this last respect, Britain was very fortunate, for here also Germany was woefully unprepared for a major war. In the whole period from the launching of the first German submarine in 1935 to the outbreak of the war, the German Navy built only 57 submarines. Only 26 of these were equipped for service in the Atlantic. These were subject to such limitation, especially in regard to their cruising range, that less than 10 could be kept in the shipping zone at any one time. British minefields in the English Channel, which destroyed 3 U-boats immediately, made it necessary for these vessels to go out by the route north of Scotland, with the result that they could not operate by reason of limited cruising range farther west than 12 degrees, and 12 degrees north and 30 degrees west, about 80 miles west of Ireland, so that the British Navy did not have to convoy further west than this line. As far as the U-boats were concerned, there was no improvement in this situation until the latter half of 1941. The number of U-boat sinkings reached 7 a month, and Germany's replacement capacity for building these weapons reached 15 a month, compared to 25 a month in the First World War. This production margin made it possible to raise the number of German submarines at sea by steady steps from 15 in April 1941 to 60 at the end of the year. This improvement, from the German point of view, was counterbalanced by an improvement in the British anti-submarine defense tactics, as we shall see, but the struggle became so severe that it is deservedly known as the Battle of the Atlantic. Our present concern with this subject lies in the fact that the inadequacy of the German submarine attack in 1934 to 1941 made it considerably easier for the British Navy to cope with the blockade problem. In contraband control work, suspicious merchant vessels were forced to put into a control harbor for search of their cargoes. Control points were placed in Canada, in the Mediterranean, in the north of Scotland, and elsewhere, but the United States would not permit one in the Caribbean Sea area. When vessels being detained began to clog up these ports, whole categories of vessels were exempt from control. This applied, for example, to American ships after January 1940. In order to reduce congestion and delay, vessels which certified that they had no contraband and gave detailed reports of their lading were issued commercial passports called navicerts by British representatives in their ports of departure and were generally exempt from search or delay. This use of navicerts, voluntarily at first, was made compulsory in July 1940. At the same time, the use of British credit, repair facilities, insurance, refueling station, charts, and all kinds of shipping aids were denied to vessels which did not have a British ship warrant. This system, with the unofficial support of the United States, gradually made it possible to control most of the shipping of the world. The United States and other countries also cooperated from 1940 in rerouting passengers and mails through points like Bermuda or Gibraltar, where they could be searched by the British. This gave Britain control of information and enemy funds for blockade purposes. In order to reduce the enemy's ability to buy abroad, financial connections were cut, his funds abroad were frozen, and his exports were blocked. So, sanctions. We call them sanctions now. The United States cooperated in these efforts as well, freezing the financial assets of various nations as they were conquered by the aggressor powers, and finally the assets of the aggressors themselves in June to July 1941. One of the chief steps in this effort was the interruption of the export of German coal by sea from the Baltic to Italy on March 5, 1940. 3 months before, Italy itself became a belligerent. This disrupted the Italian economy. Efforts to supply only half of Italy's needs from Germany by rail almost disrupted the German transportation system, since it required the use of 15,000 railroad cars. At the same time, curtailment of Italian exports and the need to buy British coal reduced the Italian gold reserve almost at once from 2.3 to 1.3 billion lira. Because the British Navy lacked ships to enforce any complete control of contraband by stopping vessels for search, various devices were adopted. Beginning in December 1939, agreements were signed with neutrals by which these latter agreed not to re-export their imports to Britain's enemies. Compulsory rationing of neutral imports was established at the end of July 1940. At the same time, preemptive buying of vital commodities at their source to prevent Germany and its allies from obtaining them began. That sounds like Venezuela. Because of the limited British funds, most of this task of preemptive buying was taken over by the United States, almost completely so by February 1941. After 1941, the blockade became increasingly effective, especially by the elimination of neutrals like the Soviet Union, Japan, and the United States, and by the shift from the quantitative to qualitative controls. Under this new system, the blockade concentrated on a few vital materials and commodities, trying to increase the rate of German usage of these, or to reduce their stocks by bombardment or sabotage, and seeking out such materials, like industrial diamonds, at their sources, frequently in remote regions of the earth, then following them by economic intelligence information to a point where Britain could get them by seizure or by preemptive purchase. The blockade was enforced by Britain with little regard for international law or for neutral rights, but there was relatively little protest from the neutrals because the most influential neutrals were already so deeply committed to one side or to the other that they could hardly be regarded as neutrals and were not prepared to defend such a status. The United States openly favored Britain, while Italy and Japan equally openly favored Germany. The Soviet Union favored neither side, but was very fearful of attack from both until April 1940. It was more fearful of Britain and France, while after the fall of Norway and France it became increasingly fearful of Germany. Both of these fears, through geographic and political circumstances, inclined it to a wholehearted economic support of Germany. This continued to the day of the German attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The Nazi-Soviet trade agreement of August 19, 1939, promised that Germany would provide 200 million marks credit to be used for machinery and industrial installations for Russia in return for Russian raw materials to the value of 180 million marks. On February 11, 1940, a new agreement increased these exchanges to 750 million marks value and provided that Russian deliveries should be made in 18 months and be paid for by German deliveries covering 27 months. The accounts to be balanced in this 2-to-3 ratio at a 6-month intervals. At the same time, Russia promised to facilitate transshipment of goods to Germany from Iran, Afghanistan, and the Far East across Siberia. This trans-Siberian leak in the blockade of Germany could have been of great significance because it allowed Germany to keep contact with allied Japan and provided a route to the tin, rubber, and oil of the Netherlands, Indies, and Southeast Asia. However, transportation difficulties, lack of full cooperation by the Russians and Japanese, as well as payment problems, kept the 1940 total for the Trans-Siberian freightage to Germany down to about 166,000 tons, of which 58,000 were soybeans and 45,000 were whale oil. In the 5 months of 1941, before the outbreak of war in Russia, this transit of goods to Germany reached 212,000 tons with soybeans and whale oil accounting for 142,000 tons of the total. Such essential items as rubber, tin, copper, wool, or lubricating oils amounted to only a small fraction of the total. Germany did much better in obtaining goods from the Soviet Union itself, for the total on this score reached 4,541,202 tons over the 22 months from September 1st, 1939 to June 22nd, 1941. The largest item in this figure were the largest items in this figure were 1,500,000 tons of grain, 777,000 tons of wood and timber, 600,000 tons of petroleum products, 165,000 tons of manganese ore, 139,000 tons of cotton, but once again, there were relatively small amounts of defense material which Germany urgently needed. On the other hand, these items Germany did obtain were very profitable to it because Germany was far behind on its payments to Russia, a situation which became worse as June 1941 approached. The materials Germany had promised in payment were industrial products of great value to the Soviet defense, and Germany delayed its shipments as much as possible because of Hitler's plan to attack eastward. The Soviet demands that Germans should catch up on their arrears of payments because one of the irritants which hastened the Nazi attack on Russia became one of the irritants which hastened the Nazi attack on Russia in 1941. So them asking for their money back really pissed you off, pissed the Nazis off. On the whole, the blockade had no decisive effect on Germany's ability to wage war until 1945. After examining the evidence on this problem, the chiefs of the blockade of the Foreign Economic Administration in Washington wrote, Germany's war production and military operations were never seriously hampered by a shortage of any essential raw materials or industrial products, with the single exception of petroleum, and even that shortage resulted from the combined effect of the Soviet Army's capture of Romanian oil fields and the concentrated bombing of Germany's synthetic production rather than directly from economic warfare. The same writers point out that Germany's food supply, in calories per capita, was at the pre-war level until the very last month of the war. The ability of Germans to cope with the blockade was largely due to their high level of engineering skill and their ruthless exploitation of conquered Europe, especially of the manpower of dominated areas. German engineering ability made it possible to get around the material shortages or to repair industrial plants damaged by air raids, but these efforts required more and more manpower, which Germany lacked. An increase in the labor supply was obtained by enslaving the captured peoples of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Russia, and other countries, and also the Jewish people. In the same way, the German food supply was kept up by starving these enslaved peoples. In the early part of the war, the blockade was not effective because of the low level of German mobilization, the slow and faulty fashion in which the blockade was perhaps necessarily applied, the large number of neutral and non-belligerent countries, the leaks to Germany across Soviet Russia, the Vichy France, the ineffectiveness of quantitative controls under a limited naval patrol, and the succession of German conquest, which brought such valuable assets as the Norwegian iron ore route, the French iron mines, the aluminium industry, the Romanian oil wells, or the Yugoslav copper mines under direct German control. The Soviet borderlands, September 1939 to April 1940. During the Phony War, the Sitzkrieg, from September 1939 to April 1940, there were persons in Britain, France, and Germany who were willing to fight to the bitter end, and other persons who were eager to make peace. Such persons engaged in extensive intrigues and cross-intrigues in order to negotiate peace or to prevent it. One of the most publicized of these efforts gave rise to the so-called Venlo Incident of November 1939. On October 9th, Hitler ordered his commanding generals to prepare for an immediate attack on the Low Countries in France. Shortly afterwards, two members of British military intelligence in the Netherlands, who were officially attached to the British diplomatic mission at The Hague, were approached by a man whom they believed to be an agent of discontented generals of the German General Staff. This man, who may have been a double agent working for both sides, wished to discuss the possibility of negotiating peace if the German generals removed Hitler and his chief associates by a coup d'etat. The proposal sounded authentic because the British leaders had been approached with similar offers, which were known to be authentic since August 1938, and there was, at that very moment, late in 1939, a member of the German General Staff who was passing information, including the date of Hitler's projected attack on Holland, to the Netherlands military attaché in Berlin. With Lord Halifax's permission, the two British officers, Major Richard Henry Stevens and Captain Sigismund Payne Best, with an observer from the Netherlands government, Lieutenant Klopp, gave 5 meetings on Dutch territory with the German negotiators. At the 5th meeting, at Venlo on November 9th, the negotiators, who were really members of the security police of the SS, shot Lieutenant Klopp and escaped into Germany with his body, the 2 British agents, a Dutch chauffeur, the automobile in which they had been traveling. The incident aroused great notoriety at the time and, in some circles, was taken to indicate that Britain was really eager to find some way out of the conflict, in spite of its proclaimed determination to fight to a finish. The Venlo incident was but one, and on the whole, a rather unimportant one, of a number of unsuccessful efforts to make peace between the Western powers and Germany in the 6 months following the defeat of Poland. These efforts, combined with the lack of fighting in the phony war, to convince the leaders of the Soviet Union that the Western powers had little heart in fighting Germany and would prefer to be fighting Russia. As we shall see, this was probably true of Chamberlain and his close associates and of Daladier and his successor as Prime Minister of France, Paul Reynaud. To avoid or at least postpone an attack from either the Western powers or Germany became the chief aim of Soviet policy, and every effort was made to strengthen Russia's military, strategic, and political position. It was felt in the Kremlin in this period from September to May that the danger of attack was greater from the Western powers than it was from Germany, since Germany was in such great need of Russian raw materials that it would probably keep the peace if the Soviet Union made serious efforts to fulfill the economic agreements it had signed with Germany. Moreover, the political agreements of August 23rd and September 28th, by giving the Soviet Union a free hand east of a specified line, made it possible for Russia to strengthen its defenses against Germany by advancing its frontiers and military bases up to that line. Furthermore, the Soviet leaders believed that full economic cooperation with Germany might persuade Hitler to bring pressure on Japan to reduce its pressure on the Soviet Far Eastern frontier. The Japanese pressure on the Soviet Far East reached its peak in the years 1938 and 1939 with 2 attacks by the Japanese army on Soviet territory. The second of these attacks at Nomonhan and the Manchurian-Mongolian frontier resulted in a major Japanese defeat in which Nippon suffered 52,000 casualties. It was ended by a truce signed on September 16, 1939, only 1 day before Russian forces began to move into Poland. Whoops, crap. From the diplomatic point of view, the Soviet Far Eastern policy was a success for Hitler in the years 1939 to 1941, put pressure on Japan to relax its efforts to expand on the northern part of the Asiatic mainland and to replace this with a movement against British Malay and the Netherlands East Indies. The Japanese defeat at Nomonhan and the fact that the raw materials which Japan needed were to be found in the south rather than in Mongolia, Siberia, or even northern China persuaded Japan to accept the change of direction. A Soviet ambassador returned to Tokyo in November 1939 for the first time since June 1938. During the period 1929 to October 1941, the Soviet Union had excellent information about Japanese affairs from its master spy in the Far East, Richard Sorge. Sorge, a member of the Nazi Party, could be Sorga, a member of the Nazi Party from 1933, representative of many German newspapers in Tokyo from the same year, and the press attaché in the German embassy in Tokyo from 1939 to 1941, had an excellent knowledge of the most secret matters in the Far East because of his own intimate relations with the German ambassador and because of his secret agents, including Sainoji, adopted son of the last Jirno, and Ozaki, advisor to Prince Konoye. In Japan, governing circles. By reporting to Moscow on the condition of the Japanese military forces and the gradual triumph within the Japanese government of the anti-British over the anti-Russian influence, Sorga made it possible for the Soviet Union to weaken its defenses in the Far East in order to strengthen them in Europe. In Europe, after the occupation of Poland, which shielded the Russian center, the Soviet leaders were worried about two areas. In the south, including the Balkans, Dardanelles, or the Caspian oil fields, they were very fearful of an Anglo-French attack, while in the Baltic, they were fearful of both the Western powers and Germany. The Soviet fears of the Western powers in the South appear quite unfounded to us, but seemed very real to them in 1939. The information which had been released since 1945 shows that there was some basis for this fear, but that the Anglo-French threat to Russia was much greater in the Baltic than it was in the South. In the latter area, the Kremlin was suspicious of the French army of the Orient in Syria. The Russians believed that General Maxim Weygand had a force of several 100,000 men which he wished to use across Iran and Turkey in an attack on the Russian oil fields in the Caspian region. In January 1940, Germany obtained reports from Paris that Weygand proposed to attack the Soviet Union from Romania. As a matter of fact, Weygand had only 3 poorly equipped divisions totaling about 40,000 men, and his plans were largely defensive. He hoped to support the Allied guarantees to Turkey, Greece, and Romania given in April 1939, and to protect the Romanian oil fields by moving northward from Salonika if Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria made any warlike move in the Balkans. The political situation in the Balkans was of such precarious stability that the Western powers did not dare to make a move in that area for fear everything would collapse. Turkey, Greece, Romania, and Yugoslavia were joined in the Balkan Entente aimed at preventing any Bulgarian aggression. Since these four states could mobilize over 100 divisions, although lacking all modern or heavy equipment, they could keep Bulgaria quiet. Unfortunately, the Balkan Entente was not designed for protection against Italy or Germany, where the real danger lay. Italy had various projects to attack Greece from the Albanian territories it had seized in April 1939. It also had fully matured plans to disrupt Yugoslavia by subsidizing and supporting a Croat revolt under Ante Pavlović under the dominant Serb majority in that state. During the Phony War, the Italians hoped that the Western powers would allow Italy to carry out its project against Yugoslavia in order to block any German movement into that area. Such permission seemed possible from the fact that the democratic states had not guaranteed Yugoslavia as they had the other three states of the Balkan Entente. Italy's project was set for early June 1940, but was interrupted by Hitler's attack in the West, which was made without notifying his Italian partner on May 10th. Another element of instability in northeastern Europe was the position of Hungary, which aspired to detach Transylvania from Romania. Since Hungary could not take this area by its own power, it sought support from Italy rather than from Germany, which the Hungarians feared. With Italian support, Hungary refused to allow German troops to cross its territory to attack Poland in 1939 and began to negotiate an agreement with Italy by which the Duke of Aosta would be offered the crown of Hungary as an anti-German solution to Hungary's ambiguous constitutional position. This project, like the one in Croatia, was upset by the growing rivalry of Germany and Russia in the Balkans. During the period from September 1939 to June 1940, Hitler had no political ambitions with respect to the Balkans or the Soviet Union. From both, he wanted nothing more than the maximum supply of raw materials and political peace, which would permit these goods to flow to Germany. Both areas cooperated fully with Germany in economic matters, but fear of Germany was so great that both areas also sought political changes which might strengthen their ability to resist Germany at a later date. Hungarian efforts to obtain support from Italy were not successful, as we have seen, because Italy wavered between fear of Germany and recognition of the fact that its own ambitions in the Balkans, the Mediterranean, or Africa could be obtained only with German support. The Balkan Entente sought support and military supplies from the Western powers, but could obtain little, since these powers believed that they did not have the equipment to defend themselves. The only important step they took was a military alliance with Turkey. This was signed with France and England on October 19, 1939, in the form of a mutual assistance pact, except that Turkey could not be compelled to take up arms against Russia. This last clause was inserted on Turkish insistence, but was kept secret, and, in consequence, the Soviet Union was not reassured by the agreement. In the meantime, the Soviet Union took steps to defend itself against any attack from the Baltic. In the period September 29th to October 10th, 1939, three of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were forced to sign military assistance pacts with Russia. Estonia and Latvia provided naval and air bases for Russian forces, while the city of Vilna was given to Lithuania by Russia. About 25,000 Russian troops were stationed in each of the three countries. Appeals from these countries to Germany for support against Russia were summarily rejected, and they were advised to yield to the Soviet demands. As part of the reorganization of this area, Hitler on September 27th ordered that the so-called Balts, German-speaking residents of the Baltic states, should be moved to Germany as quickly as possible. This was done within a month. From the Soviet point of view, Finland provided a much more important problem than any of the Baltic states. The city of Leningrad, one of Russia's greatest industrial centers with a population of 3 million persons, was joined to the Baltic Sea by the Gulf of Finland. This gulf, about 150 miles long and 50 miles wide, ran west to east, with its northern and eastern shores occupied by Finland and its southern shore largely Estonian. Leningrad, at the extreme southeastern corner of the Gulf, was at the southern end of the Karelins Isthmus, a neck of land running north and south between the Gulf and Lake Ladoga, some 20 miles farther east. The Finnish frontier crossed this isthmus from the Gulf to the Lake Ladoga, only 20 miles north of Leningrad. In other words, they were really close to the Soviet Union. On October 14th, the Soviet Union demanded that the Finnish frontier north of Leningrad be pushed back along the shore of the Gulf so that the frontier would run westward from Lake Ladoga instead of southward as formerly. This would put the Finnish frontier about 50 miles from Leningrad, leaving Finland about half of the Karelin Isthmus. In addition, the Bolsheviks demanded a 30-year lease on the Finnish naval base at Hango at the entrance of the Gulf of Finland, a strip about 100 miles long and 10 miles wide in central Finland, where the Finnish frontier came closest to the railroad line between Leningrad and Russia's ice-free port of Murmansk on the Arctic Sea. In a small area of about 25 square miles, where the Finnish frontier reached the Arctic Ocean west of Murmansk. In return for these concessions, Moscow offered a non-aggression pact about 2,000 square miles of wooded area in central Finland and permission to Finland to fortify the Åland Islands between Finland and Sweden, something which had been forbidden since 1921. It is not yet clear why Finland rejected the Russian demands of October 1939. The Germans and Russians believed that it was done under British influence, but the evidence is not available. At any rate, the Finns asked for German support and were rebuffed as early as October 6-7, 1939. Before the Russian demands were received, they ordered mobilization of their armed forces against the Soviet Union on October 9th and were reported by the German minister to be completely mobilized 10 days later. In the negotiations, Stalin abandoned the Soviet demand for Hangau if he could get the island of Rusaro nearby the islands of Surasai further up the Gulf, but insisted on most of the Karelin demand. The Finns offered about a third of the Karelin demand, but refused to grant any naval bases in the Gulf. On November 9th, the discussion broke down. 4 days later, the Finnish negotiators went home. For some unexplained reason, the Finns seem to have felt that the Russians would not attack their country, but the Soviets attacked at several points on November 29th. If the Finns had misinterpreted the Soviet determination to attack, the Soviets misrepresented the Finns' determination to resist. Although attacked at 5 major points by large forces with heavy equipment, the Finns made a very skillful use of the terrain and winter weather. In the first 2 months, December to January, A half dozen or more Soviet divisions were torn to pieces. Only in February 1940 did the Soviet offensive begin to move, and by the end of the month, Finland's forces were so exhausted by superior numbers that they accepted the Soviet terms. Peace was signed on March 12, 1940. As soon as Finland realized that Russia's seriously intended to attack, it set up a new cabinet under Ritso Raiti to wage the war and simultaneously seek peace by negotiation. This latter proved to be difficult because on December 2nd, Moscow set up a puppet Finnish government under a minor and discredited Finnish communist in exile, V. Kuusinen. A mutual aid pact was signed with this puppet state at once. The existence of this regime discouraged Germany from offering any mediation seeking peace in spite of its eagerness to see the end of the fighting in Finland. But on March 12th, when peace was made with the authentic Finnish government, Kuusinen was simply left in the lurch by Moscow. The Soviet attack on Finland provided the leaders in the Entente countries with a heaven-sent opportunity to change the declared but unfought war with Germany, which they did not want, into an undeclared but fighting war against the Soviet Union. The fact that a Russian war would be hundreds of miles away while the war with Germany was on their doorstep was an added advantage, especially in Paris, which had been steadily resisting British suggestions for any unfriendly actions against Germany along the Rhine. Accordingly, Britain and France resurrected the moribund League of Nations, violated the covenant to put Finland, Egypt, and South Africa on the Council, and illegally, according to the American Journal of International Law, expelled Russia from the League as an aggressor. That Russia was an unprovoked aggressor is beyond question, but there was at least a surface inconsistency between the violence of the Anglo-French reaction against Russian aggression in 1939 and the complacency with which they had viewed other aggressions in 1931 to 1939, meaning basically the Nazis. This last act of the League of Nations was its most efficient. Although the League's consideration of the Japanese aggression in China had required 15 months and resulted in no punishment, Russia was condemned in 11 days in December 1939. The German aggressions of 1936 to 1939 had not even been submitted to the League of Nations, and the Italian seizure of Albania had been recognized by Britain with unseemly haste earlier in 1939. But the Anglo-French leaders now prepared an attack in the Soviet Union, both from Finland and from Syria. In the north, every effort was made by France and Britain to turn the Soviet attack on Finland into a general war against Russia. On December 19, 1939, the Supreme War Council decided to provide Finland with all indirect assistance in their power and to use diplomatic pressure on Norway and Sweden to aid Finland against Russia. The Scandinavian countries were informed of this on December 27th. On February 5, 1940, the Supreme War Council decided to send to Finland an expeditionary force of 100,000 heavily armed troops to fight the Soviet hordes. Germany at once warned Norway and Sweden that it would take action against them if two Scandinavian countries permitted passage of this force. Germany and Russia were both eager to end the Finnish fighting before any Anglo-French intervention could begin, the former because it feared that Anglo-French forces in Scandinavia would be able to stop shipments of Swedish iron ore across Norway to Germany through the seaport of Narvik, the Russians because they were convinced of an Anglo-French desire to attack them. The evidence supports both of these fears. Because of its very high quality, Swedish iron ore was essential to the German steel industry. In 1938, Germany imported almost 22 million tons of ore, of which almost 9 million tons came from Sweden and over 5 million came from France. A German-Swedish trade agreement of December 22, 1939, promised that Sweden would ship 10 million tons of ore in 1940, of which 2 or 3 million would go by way of Narvik. As early as September 1939, the British were discussing a project to interrupt the Narvik shipments either by an invasion of Norway or by mining Norwegian territorial waters when Germany heard of the Anglo-French expeditionary force being prepared to cross Norway to Finland. It assumed that it was merely an excuse to cut off the ore shipments. Accordingly, Germany began to prepare its own plans to seize Norway first. There's like a little break there. As a matter of fact, the Anglo-French expeditionary force was really intended to attack Russia, but it was unable to arrive on time, although Britain and France did all they could to force Finland to continue to fight until they could arrive on the scene. In February, word was sent that if Finland made peace, the two Western powers would not be bound to support Finnish independence after the Great War ended. On January 3rd, the British ambassador was withdrawn from Moscow. On February 26th, Lord Halifax rejected a Soviet request that Britain convey its peace terms to Finland. They had to be sent through Sweden instead. On March 4th, Daladier and Lord Ironsides formally promised Finland an expeditionary force of 57,000 men. The Scandinavian countries put pressure on Finland not to ask for troops and informed Britain that they would tear up their railroad tracks if the expeditionary force tried to cross. When the request from the Finns did not arrive, Daladier on March 8th sent them a threatening message which said, "I assure you, once more, we are ready to give our help immediately. The airplanes are ready to take off. The operational force is ready. If Finland does not now make her appeal to the Western powers, it is obvious that at the end of the war, the Western powers cannot assume the slightest responsibility for the final settlement regarding Finnish territory." According to the Finnish Foreign Minister V. Tanner Daladier, Daladier at this time told the French military attaché in Paris that if Finland stopped fighting Russia, the Western powers would make peace with Germany. According to the same authority, Anglo-French agents did all they could, up to the final moment, to prevent or to disrupt the Soviet-Finnish peace negotiations and had made plans to cross Scandinavia, even without permission, and to use any Finnish appeal for expeditionary force as a weapon to arouse the Scandinavian people to overthrow their own governments. The Swedish Prime Minister, in return, threatened to fight on the side of Russia against any Entente effort to force a transit. When the Finnish request did not come, Britain, on March 12th, informed Norway and Sweden that it had arrived and made a formal request for transit across the two countries. This was refused, and Finland made peace the same day. The Soviet-Finnish peace treaty. No, come on. Who printed this book? On page 681, it says the Soviet-Finnish Peach Treaty, Peach. Obviously, that's a typo. Unless they had a peach treaty. Wait, hold on. Let me read a little bit more. Maybe they were trading peaches. Wait, you can't grow peaches in Finland. Okay. The Soviet-Finnish Peach Treaty of March 12, 1940, was made at the insistence of the Finnish commander-in-chief, Baron Mannerheim, although it was much more severe than the Russians' demand of October, in addition to the areas in the north at the naval base at Hangzhou. The Soviet aggressors took many of the islands of the Gulf of Finland and the whole of the Caroline Isthmus, including all shortages of Lake Ladoga. These gains made it possible for Russia to bring both official and unofficial pressures on Finland to influence its foreign and domestic policy. To resist this steady pressure, Finland began, in August 1940, secret military conversations with Germany. The failure of the Anglo-French expeditionary force to reach Finland does not mean that no aid reached the Finns. Germany refused all aid and intercepted most of Italy's aid, releasing it again once peace had been made. The Western powers, however, encouraged volunteers to go and sent much valuable equipment. Early in March, Chamberlain wrote to his sister about Finnish aid as follows. They began by asking for fighter planes, and we sent all the surplus we could lay hands on. They asked for AA guns, and we stripped our own imperfectly armed home defenses to help them. They asked for small arms ammunition, and we gave them priority over our own army. They asked for later types of planes, and we sent them 12 Hurricanes against the will and advice of our air staff. They said that men were no good now, but that they would want 30,000 in the spring. The Soviet-Finnish Peace Treaty of March 12th did not put an end to the Anglo-French projects to attack Russia or to cross Scandinavia. Anger against both the Soviet Union and the Scandinavian countries remained high in Paris and London. The Finnish expeditionary force was kept together in England, where its existence gave a powerful incentive to the German project to invade Norway before Britain did so. On April 5th, only 4 days before the German attack on Norway, Lord Halifax sent a note to Norway and Sweden threatening these countries with dire, if unstated, consequences at the hands of Britain if they refused to cooperate with the Western powers in sending aid to Finland in whatever manner they see fit, and in any future Soviet attacks on Finland. 6 days later, 2 days after Germany's aggression against Denmark and Norway, General Weygand was ordered to attack the Soviet Union from Syria. This project had been initiated on January 19, 1940, when Daladier ordered General Gamelin and Admiral Jean Darlan to draw up plans to bomb Russia's Caucasian oil fields from Syria. These plans were submitted on February 22nd, but were held up in favor of the Finnish project. On April 11th, a month after the Soviet-Finnish peace, the new French Premier, Reynaud, ordered General Weygand to carry out the raid on the Soviet oil wells of the Caucasus as soon as possible. Weygand was unable to do this before the end of June. By that time, France had been defeated by Germany, and Britain was in no position to attack any new enemies. All right. I'm just going to stop right there. The next section is the German attack on Denmark and Norway, April 1940, which is on page 682. The link for the PDF is in the description if you just want to read ahead yourself, and go ahead and finish reading the book, because it's going to take me like at least another month and a half or more at this rate. But in this section, you can kind of see again how they didn't really want to attack Germany, at least Britain and France. They really didn't want to, but Germany, again, was making moves. So they were basically pressuring everyone into a war. And then, you know, you can see all the deals they try to make between Russia, Poland, and it's basically like a risk game or like a chess game where they're just trying to position each other in a way where they're in a more beneficial position, but the other people can't attack them. And they're making all these backdoor deals. And you can see the whole time trade, it just never stopped. The easiest way to end all these wars would have been for the industrialists to just stop shipping, you know, iron ore and aluminum and steel and making planes and all this other stuff. So obviously that this is what people are saying about the whole like Rockefeller thing and all this other stuff, where it's like, well, if you really want to stop having wars, just stop building warplanes. Just stop, you know, it really is that simple. Like people are like, oh no, that's not how the world works. That is how the world works. The people that make guns, if it was illegal for them to make guns, and I'm not saying have no guns, that's stupid. But, you know, like if there's only 2 people in the world that are smart enough to build a nuclear bomb, right? And no one else is smart enough to do it, according to, you know, whatever people think about who's smart or whatever, then maybe you shouldn't do it. But of course, the profit motive is always there. And that's why capitalism, you know, is kind of like a strength and a weakness, because there's always the profit motive, even to sell weapons to people while they're air bombing your major cities. I mean, it's ridiculous when you really think about it, right? Like we're supposed to be all, oh my God, what happened in the Holocaust and this and that, right? And feel guilty about it. But meanwhile, the British government was literally selling iron ore and steel to Germany while Germany was simultaneously air bombing London. Right. So if you try to convince me that it's like the citizens' fault, or you guys are too poor, you're not working hard enough, don't have enough. No matter what we do, they will still have a war. No matter what we do, and they'll just try to gaslight you and make you think that it's the population's fault. Oh, it's either the left, like you're using too much energy, you're using too much resources, or the right's like, oh, you're too poor. You're poor people are the cause of all the world's problems. Right? Don't focus on what the rich people are doing. Don't focus on the people that actually have power and authority to do all this stuff. You know who's really to blame for all the world's problems? Poor, low IQ people sucking up all the excess resources, right? It's like, get the fuck out of here, bro, with that shit. It's bullshit. Okay. So, thanks for watching. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this. Anyway, have a good day and peace.